Welcome back, everybody, from the networking portion of the events. As I mentioned earlier, and for those of you who just are joining us newly, this is Startup Happy Hour. It's a monthly informal community building and learning event for founders, entrepreneurs, and innovators. All right, one last thing before we dive into the meat of the program with the interviews is we would like to thank StartupSac's annual sponsors, without whose support we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So they are SMUD, Whitson Law, Bender Insurance, Nivigen Pharmaceuticals, Stoll Reeves, Weintraub Tobin, Holcomb Law, Clifton Larson Allen, Moneta Ventures, and Ernst & Young. And I'd like to do a special shout out to SMUD and play this short 30-second ad from SMUD.
My friends and I think about the future a lot.
And it's looking brighter.
Because SMUD's improving our air.
Helping the planet.
And using technology and new ideas to power healthy communities.
Where we can all live, work, and play.
By 2030, SMUD will be 100% carbon-free, so you can live in a clean power city. Join the charge with SMUD at cleanpowercity.org.
Awesome. So once again, thank you to SMUD for their support. And to all our sponsors for their support. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I'm going to cue it up to my co-founder and of StartupSac, Laura Good, who will be leading the interview with TCheck. Laura, are you ready?
Right. So first, I want to really thank Peichen and Bob for joining us today. I've been following what they've been doing. Actually, with Bob, I've been following what he's been doing for probably over 10 years. And then Peichen, probably, 5 or 6 years. I think I met you when you were first starting TCheck. But before we get deeply into TCheck, I'm going to ask each of you to just share a little bit about your prior experience. And then I also want to let everyone know who's joining us here. We're going to have Q&A at the end, but if you have a burning question that you'd like to get answered right away, if you type it in the chat, I'll kind of monitor that. And if I think it's something that we should interrupt the interview for and ask, then I will do that. So, anyway, like I said, I'd love to hear a little bit about your pre-TCheck experience. And let's start with Bob on this one.
All right. So I think you know most of my story already, Laura, but I was way back, I was a co-founder for a company called Serologic. I was the CEO, and we made storage semiconductor chips. And we ended up selling the company for close to $180 million. So it was a good exit. And more recently, I was invited to try to turn around a couple startups. The first one was Widget, which was a wheelchair accessory that allowed people to prevent their help them to be stronger and use levers to drive their wheelchairs. And we sold that company. And then right before I joined TCheck, I was the CEO of iSnap, and we transferred that to a company in Miami, and that company is currently in mothballs because their focus was in the cruise industry. So right now it's just in hold. And most likely, and the most one I've been having right now is working for TCheck, and which is completely different than any other job I've ever had.
Yeah. Well, cool. Thank you, Bob, for sharing that.
Yep.
Peichen, you want to tell us a little bit about life before TCheck?
Sure. I was actually a military brat. So I grew up on Okinawa, Japan, which is a tiny little island about 2 hours, 1,000 miles south of Tokyo. And in that environment, I was about as far from cannabis as you can possibly imagine, right? I mean, Japan is very cannabis unfriendly. The military, my dad was a drill sergeant before, I came along. And so, that attitude changed, pretty dramatically a number of years ago, 6 years ago, when I met someone who used cannabis to treat her medical conditions. And so, that's kind of how I was brought up. Before TCheck, I worked for, big companies like HP, where I met Bob. I tried a couple of startups, crashed and burned them both. They were fun and expensive learning opportunities, if you will. But here I am nowadays. Took a lot of those opportunities and actually are rolling some of them into TCheck.
Awesome. And I want to clarify for our audience, the official name of your company is Engineered Medical Technologies. Is that right?
It is.
Yeah. But TCheck is so much more fun to say. So
we call that a DBA.
a DBA. Oh, are you actually DBA of TCheck?
Not technically, actually. We haven't filed paperwork.
All right. Well, now that we've brought up TCheck, why don't you briefly tell people what TCheck is and what it does?
Okay, I can start. So TCheck is basically it's this device right here. Okay, there's a little tray that goes along with it. It is a portable spectrometer, and it measures the potency of cannabis and cannabis infusions. So if you're using cannabis to treat your medical condition like Parkinson's, for example, or epilepsy, it's kind of important to get the dose right. It's not like you pop an Advil, but you don't know how strong this Advil is. So TCheck helps people who use cannabis to treat medical conditions know exactly how strong the medication is. And so prior to this, it didn't exist, and we've helped out quite a few people with this device.
Awesome. So now that we all know what the device is, can you tell us the origin story of TCheck?
Bob, would you mind doing that? Because you tell it better than I do.
Yeah, sure. We had a friend who suffered from Parkinson's, and she was not a smoker, but she found that eating edibles really helped control her tremors. And one of our friends found, and she would test it. Sometimes they would be weak. And one day, our friend found her couch locked on the sofa, and it was way too strong. And so that was sort of the genesis of the company in terms of, hey, how do we, we and Peichen and being the engineers, how do we address this issue? And Peichen actually went out and talked to hundreds of people and realized that this is a real market. And so that was through a couple of large prototypes and a long time. We've developed it to where we are today with what we call TCheck, which is actually the second generation of our product. So that's the story of how we all got going. And just to add one more thing is there was a stigma attached with being in the cannabis market. I called my dad. I said, Dad, what do you think? And he said, don't be silly, Bob, just go join the company, right? So I just want to let you know there is a stigma associated with cannabis, and I didn't want to trash my career if I went into the wrong spot, but my dad just said, forget it, go do it. So, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Peichen, could you share a little bit about how you developed the prototype and where you were when you did that?
Actually, I wasn't the guy who first came up with the physics, I guess, if you will, behind it. It was another one of our co-founders. So when this question was posed, this other co-founder, Brian Calger, another founder with Bob with Serologic, he went off to his garage. It's literally his garage, right? And he and his daughter, who's a medical doctor, figured out that that cannabis absorbs UV light extremely well. And so they made this contraption out of all things, a lizard light. And it was humongous, right? The size of, I don't know, 2 shoe boxes. It glowed. It literally glowed, right? And when you turn it on, the lights flickered and all that kind of stuff. And to Bob's story, I literally took this monstrosity, monster, and I stood on street corners in front of dispensaries going, "Hey, I got this thing. Can you use it?" And they kind of look at me sideways, going, "This is the size of a small refrigerator." But ultimately, the need for such a device to measure cannabis was extremely strong. And so, the signal that we got from hundreds, well over 300 interviews, was that it was super strong. And let me tell you another story. So one of my previous startups was a device that was measuring, ultra high speed Ethernet. My buddy and I who did that one, we're so afraid of people stealing the idea, right? And ultimately, we learned that somebody stealing the idea is not the worst thing in the world. Nobody wanting your idea is the worst thing in the world. And so that was a big lesson learned from my previous startup, one of my previous startups. And so this time, that's why I was so willing to take this beast and stand on three corners and get real feedback, right? The goods, the bads, the ugly. So yeah, that's kind of how the engineering kind of started. And then after that, it became take this monster, turn it into a physical manifestation, a physical product that somebody might want, right? Test market it again, and then iterate upon that. So I should really keep one of those, the first generations around. It was the same size, literally. But it's a lot of work to get from that, from that question, right? From, hey, I had this need, to something that works, right? That monstrosity. It's an equal amount of work to take that monstrosity to something that's shippable, right? And then we're finding that it was an equal amount of work to get from one shippable unit to 500 shippable units. And now where we are is getting from 500 shippable units to 1,000 shippable units a month, right? And so those are all giant stepping stones in the life of the company, if you will. That was almost like reinvention of the company, like every single one of those steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't think you guys mentioned, I mean, there was equipment that could do what you guys are doing. Just, it was very expensive, right? And usually only found in a lab. Is that true in terms of measuring the THC level?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So the market you are addressing is the home use.
So traditionally, when you make an edible, either you send to a lab, and back then you paid $100 for a lab test. Okay. The equipment that was needed to run, figure out how strong this edible was is called a high performance liquid chromatographer. It's about the size of a dorm fridge, and it costs about $50,000. And so obviously 50 grand was, pretty far out of reach for most homes, especially for a cannabis tester. And so that's why we came up with, this small thing, taking arguably some of the physics off of that monster and shrinking it down to, the small thing, right? The big eureka moment was, with those lab instruments, those things can test anything, right? You can test, you can take, stream water, right? From the local streams, or you can take blood and stick it in there. You can take some unknown medication and stick it in there. It'll tell you what it is, right? So it does anything and everything. It's a general purpose instrument. So the big difference between that and what we've made here at TCheck is that TCheck is what we call an application specific spectrometer. You can figure out what that acronym comes out to. I can see you thinking about it. And so what we did was TCheck was we took this instrument that can measure anything. We said, well, let's narrow down that problem space, right? Let's figure out, well, what do the customers need most, right? They need to measure cannabis butter. They need to measure coconut oil, olive oil, and then alcohol-based tinctures, if you will, alcohol-based infusion. And so when we said, okay, well, instead of saying we can measure anything and everything, we can just measure those 4 things, right? That's it, no more, right? And that was what really allowed us to take that dorm fridge thing and shrink it down to, the size of a deck of cards.
Yeah. And what's the cost of the product now?
So we MSRP for $300.
$300. Great.
Yeah, we have, add-ons and accessories and all that kind of stuff. So it jacks it up a little bit.
Yeah. So this question, I think it might be fun to have Bob answer it at first, since Bob, I think your initial companies that you worked for were more software based. Is that correct? Or no?
As it turns out, designing chips is really software intensive, right? And so that's, it was a lot of software, a lot of simulation, a lot of design, a lot of firmware that was developed. And then we handed off all the information to our chip supplier, and they would manufacture the chips, and then we sold the chips with everything else. So that's how it all worked out. So when you're in the semiconductor business, which is no longer a fundable business, we must have hit it just right. We raised $35 million, and I remember the first $5 million we spent in the first 3 weeks in terms of not spending it, but committing it in terms of tools and in terms of mask charges and everything else, right? We ended up raising $32 million for Serologic. It was a capital intensive business.
Yeah. Well, which speaks to actually hardware startups can be more capital intensive than software startups because you actually have to buy and order and inventory parts. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges, either of you, that a hardware startup has to overcome that don't really exist for a software or service startup?
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about a software business, the R&D investment is high, but the cost of reproducing that software is really low. And so it's a different business model. But when you're in the hardware business, as I talked about spending millions of dollars for mask charges for chips, we have to buy a lot of inventory. We have to work supply chains. We have to work with contract manufacturers. So it's a very complex business in terms of trying to keep the train on the tracks, right? In terms of us, and of course, in hardware, in a hardware company, you can't recognize revenue until you ship products. And so that's the most important part of hardware. And hardware, I mean, one thing we didn't mention is there's a lot of software. We have phone apps and everything else where a lot of the IP is, but the hardware, our system won't work without that, the TCheck that Peichen showed you before, right? But it's, in a way, it's a combination of a lot of software. We have databases, we have a whole bunch of other infrastructure around our products, but primarily we're a hardware company. And if we don't have hardware to ship, we can't recognize revenue. We can take orders, but we can't recognize revenue, which is what the goal is for a business.
Yeah. Well, and also, I've worked in hardware too, a satellite communication or a satellite antenna for mobile
communication. I remember that.
Yep. Yeah. And some of the problem is the lead time on these parts and how much you have to have an inventory, and you're missing one little thing, but you can't ship product. So there's this whole wizardry that goes on to determine, what to keep on the shelf and when to order stuff.
It's still happening, Laura. I just want if you notice, Peichen and I just smile because we are fighting that problem today, right? So no, it's a real problem in terms of, so all of a sudden a supplier who is shipping in 2 weeks, all of a sudden without notice will say, oh, it's 6 to 8 weeks. Yeah. And of course, as not everybody knows, but there's an IC shortage, a global IC shortage on top of everything else, right? And so it's really tough to be able to secure all the components you need to be able to ship product.
Yeah, and it's not just getting them in the door and on the shelf. You also have to pay for those parts. So, or get some clever purchasing agreements out there.
Absolutely. And we're doing both, right? But, and since we were a young company, we had to prepay a lot of things up front, which impacted our cash flow, right? That's just that's all part of being in the hardware business, right? Inventory control, being able to have cash flow to be able to buy enough inventory to have enough to be able to ship.
So have you ever had to make little agreements with suppliers, like, if you ship me that product, I'll pay this invoice? That's past due. You ever had to play that game?
I'll let you answer that one, Peichen.
Oh, it's worse than that.
Yeah.
Okay. It's at the point where it's, if you ship me this product, I will pay 300% over MSRP on that part.
Oh, wow.
Okay. It's the chip scalper.
Shortages. Yeah.
Yeah. For some of the chips that we have, there are people like going, I'll pay you 10x for that part. Okay. For what we paid for it. And we're like, no, because we make more than that on our product. But the chip shortage is very, very, very real.
Wow.
You know, yeah, if we hadn't gone on this crazy chip buying spree we did, you know, two months ago now, our company would be dead right now, completely dead. Because lead times for some chips went from 2 weeks to over 60 weeks.
Wow, that's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is it. So speaking of some of these problems in getting parts.
Being in the hardware business is not for the,
And not for the faint of heart.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So what impact did the pandemic have on these part shortages or other part supply chain issues? And how did you overcome
Number
them?
one, Hacker Lab. Rockland died.
Yeah.
So we had to move. So our company got started basically in Hack. I mean, we started in the garage, yeah, for sure. But it was very, very soon afterwards that we moved into Hacker Lab Rockland location. We had a lot of space up there, right? We were renting a couple of offices, several offices up there actually, and we just kept growing and growing our footprint. And then unfortunately, COVID came along, and Hacker Lab's business model got impacted, which meant that that the renters, us, also got impacted. So Bob and I went out and started looking for real estate. That was my first introduction to commercial real estate anyway. Now, there's, not everything was a challenge, right? Because the other, I guess you can, it's horrible to say this. The other benefit to that was that commercial real estate prices got very depressed, okay? Because nobody was looking for new leases at the time. And so because of that, we were fortunate to come into a situation where we were able to negotiate a very competitive lease agreement here in the space that we have. So, there's silver linings in sort of everything, right? When the pandemic first hit, all of our ability to forecast just completely went out the window, right? Nobody knew who was going to buy what was even going to be available, all that kind of stuff. The other challenge was, like you said, supply chain, right? So, our parts are small, right? They're tiny. And so we generally ship them by air. Well, when the pandemic went down, all air travel stopped. Well, that also means that all air cargo stopped, right? Because, the top half of the airplane is people, the bottom half of the airplane is cargo. And so we had a lot of challenges trying to get material. We manufacture primarily, our PCBs are done primarily in Taiwan. We had a lot of problems getting material out of Taiwan into the United States because there were no airplanes flying. So yeah, there were definitely challenges there.
Have you had to change any of your suppliers in terms of where they're geographically located to still produce during COVID?
Bob?
I run the supply chain. And we are always looking at changing and updating our suppliers. One thing that Peichen didn't mention is, we actually really slowed down, and a lot of people were furloughed during the first few months. And surprisingly, the only people we kept in, and we kept them physically distant and timing, was our production workers. And all of a sudden we started seeing our orders increase. And so, in California, right, and many of the other states, they considered cannabis dispensaries as, a critical thing to keep open. Well, that helped us as well. And the other thing is a lot of people were on unemployment and had extra cash, so they were buying a lot of product. So to make a long story short, we actually sold a lot of products during the pandemic, and it moves forward. One thing I do want to mention is we are still feeling the challenges of the pandemic. Supply chains are still constrained. Sometimes I couldn't buy polyethylene. Sometimes the price of our foam has skyrocketed. There's batteries are 6 weeks late, things like that in terms of keeping the supply chain main. So there's still logistic issues. There's still hundreds of container ships out in the water waiting to get unloaded. So there's a lot of people who don't have product today. And we're lucky enough to have products today. But I just want to let you know this: we are still feeling a lot of supply chain pressure, even in our business.
Wow.
I live and die by it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it sounds like though you know what's going on, and that's half the battle. So
yep. We live it daily, right?
Yeah, exactly. So are you using any of the old production tools like boards with cards where you move everything around, or to know when your parts are getting here and all that, or are you all automated with software on that?
Yeah, we don't use cards anymore. I mean, my wife, I can tell you right now, my wife used to use cards way back in the early HP days, but no, we don't use cards anymore. We just track it. We just track all of our critical components and all of our long lead time items.
So are you doing that on an Excel spreadsheet, or are you using a manufacturing software platform that maybe you'd recommend for early stage hardware startups?
No, Excel. Go with Excel.
Excel. I mean, I'll be frank, we tried an MRP system, but the overhead associated with it wasn't worth the effort. However, as we continue to scale, and that's our goal, I think sooner or later we're going to have to find an MRP system that will help control this and be able to automate a lot of these things, but as well as our order management system, as well as our bank. And that's one of our challenges, is in terms of how do we integrate all those things together.
Yeah, that's definitely not easy. So I want to move on and ask you a little bit more about the industry or the vertical that you're in. And the cannabis space is a dynamic vertical. And even though you guys don't directly sell cannabis, you're still affected by issues in the industry. So I wondered, and this is a loaded question because I know the answer. Do you have any stories to share about how being in the cannabis industry has impacted TCheck? Any horror stories on doing business?
I'll pass that to Peichen.
Wait, so somebody once told me a long time ago, anytime there's uncertainty, there's opportunity. So, during the breakout session, I spoke with Joe and Thomas, a couple of guys that's on here right now, and they're both in the Bitcoin space, right? And boy, there's a lot of uncertainty there, right? I mean, look at China just, made that big announcement, this week, earlier last week, whatever. Anyhow, but when there's that uncertainty, boy, man, there's money to be made. I'll tell you what. Okay, so I would not look at all of these challenges as challenges. I look at them as opportunities, because if you can solve them, guess what? The next guy can't. Okay, and so that gives you a leg up. That gives you a lead, right? So one of the big opportunities in cannabis was, well, because it was federally regulated. That means the big boys like the Agilents, the Waters, the Shimadzus. Shimadzu's already, but a lot of those guys can't really play in the space. Right. And so they were limited in what they were allowed to do and sell and market and engage. And so that gave us, a tiny little company, opportunity to come in and build something. Likewise, in the time that we're right now, cannabis is not federally legally regulated, which means the FDA, the USDA, the EPA, those guys can't really get involved. Right. Which means, again, we can go build something and not have to get FDA approval or USDA approval or anything like that. And so, to me, this is all tremendous opportunity to dive in. Now, of course, there are for sure challenges, right? I mean, we've gotten kicked in the teeth by everybody you can possibly imagine, right? The big famous story was, when we first launched our product, our sales started climbing, right? And our credit card processor came down one day and said, we just made a rule change. Y'all need to get off our computer, our systems in 5 days. Okay, 5 calendar days. This is a Thursday afternoon at about 4 or 5 p.m. And today counted, Saturday and Sunday also counted. So that means you have till Monday to find yourself a new credit card processor. Obviously that was an uncomfortable situation, because all of our sales go through credit card processing. And so, the whole company, we just dropped everything and dove into this solution. Unfortunately, we were able to pull it off, right? In 5 days, we actually rebuilt our website from the ground up. We deleted our entire social media presence and rebuilt it. So effectively, we completely rebranded the entire company in 5 days, and we're able to secure a credit card processor in that time. And so, that's just one big example of some of the things that kicked us in the teeth early on. But the problems continue to mount, right? As Bob mentioned, hardware company. That means we have to buy a lot of inventory, right? We have huge amount of our working capital tied up in inventory right now. But we can't get any loans, right? We're not going to get an SBA loan. Was it last week? UC Davis sent a thing out saying, "Hey, we have this thing for entrepreneurs and all that kind of stuff. Mentorship for entrepreneurs." And we're like, "Yeah, we're interested in talking." We signed up. We call them up, and this guy from SBA gets on the phone, and literally within the first 45 seconds or so, he goes, "Oh, you're Cannabis? I need to stop talking to you now. I need to get off the phone. I can't be having this conversation." Right? He was so nervous about just even remotely being anywhere associated with a cannabis company. He couldn't talk to us. Yeah, it was.
And he lived in Mendocino.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, no kidding, right? The insanity thing is, like the left hand and the right hand of these organizations don't really talk to each other, right? Last spring, again, UC Davis came along and said, "Hey, we have these interns that are looking for jobs," and we're like, "Yeah, we're hiring," right? UC Davis has a cannabis program. Okay, they're doing cannabis research, they're doing hemp research, and all that stuff. But when I end up talking to the career center, they're like, "Oh, you're Cannabis. I can't talk to you. Go away." And so stuff like this happens all the time. Yeah. It's almost expected now. And so anytime I talk to new service providers, whether it be like even photographers or videographers or voice artists or voice actors or whatever, my very first question to them is always, "Are you willing to deal with a cannabis company?"
Yeah.
Because I just don't want to spend the time, right? If they're not.
Yeah. And I think that would surprise some people because you don't sell cannabis. You sell a device that can be used to measure the THC levels in cannabis. Right. I don't think you sell any cannabis. You didn't use to.
No, we don't. We don't manufacture it. No. Manufacture, transport, even market cannabis itself. So we don't touch it at all. But it actually doesn't matter. We're associated with the business, so therefore we are, what's that term? We got an albatross or something like that?
Yeah.
We're considered an ancillary company. So we, as Peichen kind of implied, we can treat credit cards online. We have banking relationships, in terms of, we have none of the problems that dispensaries and anybody who touches the material have, right? So we're kind of unique because we don't touch the material. We're just I view us as an instrumentation company. Yeah.
So speaking, the credit card companies, have they loosened up at all during the, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago that you had the credit card company drop you? I just wondered if.
Not really. We still use what's called a high-risk credit card processor here. Somebody I met actually at one of the Haney Biz events. So we don't get to. How about this? Apple Pay won't do business with us.
Oh, all right. Well, anything else more you want to share about being an, do you say an ancillary company, cannabis ancillary company that might be helpful to anyone who is looking at product or service related to cannabis?
The cannabis ecosystem is massive, okay? And so there are lots of services and everything that really needs to happen with the cannabis ecosystem. Now, there's a lot of big companies that aren't willing to play ball. Okay, and so if you run a company or you're associated with a company or whatever it is that might be willing to, I'm not going to say lean in, I'm going to say evaluate, your potential clients for what they actually are, right? For example, in our case, we're an instrumentation company. We don't sell cannabis, okay? But the fact that our customers do sell cannabis, and so if you're willing to say, okay, well, yeah, you guys are you are an instrumentation company. You don't sell cannabis, even though you're in the industry. If you're willing to lean into that or be open to having those discussions, I think there's a huge amount of money to be made, right? I mean, things that you never think about, right? We talked about banking and all that. That's sort of obvious, but things like insurance, 401k plans, dental plans, rent, supply chain, management, supply chain software, accounting, bookkeepers, HR, and all that, everything. Everything you associate with a regular old non-cannabis business, we have here in the cannabis business. And so, just be willing to have those conversations and be willing to assess companies and their risk profile on their own merits and not just, out of hand say, oh, no cannabis, I'm done. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
And the other thing I just want to mention that we haven't really talked about is we really have to be careful in terms of how we message marketing, social media, all those things. You have to be very careful. Otherwise, you'll be shut down, right? Or banned. And so it's the challenge in terms of walking the tightrope in terms of how much can you market and get it out with before they'll either shut you down, or put you on timeout. Right. So there are some other complications other than just business ones in terms of market.
Yeah. So I'm not sure, Bob, I think you're breaking up a little bit. Was it just me?
I think it was me. I got a message saying I had. So what I was saying is unstable. Social marketing, social media, all sorts of marketing. You have to be very careful in terms of if you go with Instagram, or we can't advertise on Facebook. We have a Facebook page, but we can't advertise on Facebook because they just don't support cannabis companies, right? So those are the challenges some of the challenges we face daily.
Yeah.
Any marketing company out there or anybody knows marketing, if you can figure out ways to dance around the social media rules with regards to cannabis marketing, right? I guess you can say skirt the rules, right? We built things like sanitized websites where we don't use cannabis, or we use words like herbal and infusions, that kind of thing. If you figure out a good formula for that, you're gonna make some bank. Because there's a lot of cannabis companies out there, and like ours, that need this service. That we're basically reinventing. Every single one of us is reinventing the wheel every single time.
Yeah. So I'm going to explore one more area before we open it up to questions, and that's raising money. And I think, tell us a little bit about. I know you have raised some, I think, angel investment. I don't know if you have any VC funding yet, but do you want to share anything about that with our audience?
Are you looking at me, Peichen, or do you want to talk?
I am looking at you.
Okay, so
yeah, because you have more experience raising.
Yeah, I do. As you know, I've raised some money, and so luckily friends and family, we've raised a lot of money. Sac Angels have been excellent for us, right? And they give us a lot of coaching. It's really nice to have local Sac Angel investors, and we have many of them. And then we actually have some outside other angel investors as well. We're currently going out for a Series A for our next generation product. And so we are really cranking on going out for what a Series A is. All of our existing angels use what we call convertible notes. And then once the Series A comes in and sets the evaluation, all those convertible notes turn into preferred stock. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of how it works. But we're very active in terms of raising capital right now. Very active, and so that's the good news. And you've got to be going back to it. There's certain VCs that are willing to invest in cannabis, and there's a lot of them that can't. It all depends upon where they get their limited partners funds from, and any federal money or any other funds that restrict have strict restrictions that we don't even talk to, right? So we always have to look at their theses and whatever else. But you'd be amazed on how many cannabis friendly funds there are out there right now.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a lot of money currently.
Isn't there one I seem to remember reading in the Business Journal, like Canna Angels or Canna Angels are one of your investors?
Yes.
Yeah, that's an angel group out of San Francisco.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that
and
was
then,
a very successful. That was a very successful outing for us.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then we also have well, yeah. How about this? There are the environment for cannabis investment is definitely opening up, if you will. The numbers are still, on a comparative scale, it's so small, because we're currently raising a $3 million round. Okay, and so for a lot of other businesses and companies, $3 million is a seed round, right? It's like with Bob's first investment, $3 million doesn't really even get you started, right? They spent it in weeks, days, something like that. So Series A in those realms is on the order of 25 million-ish kind of range. Whereas in cannabis, 3 million is definitely in the Series A, Series A price round.
Mhm. So
That was a good question, Laura.
yeah. You were on a show recently too. What was the name? Peichen, you presented.
A couple of actually.
Oh, you've been on a couple. Okay.
So probably the more famous one is called Elevator Pitch by Entrepreneur Magazine. So it's like the Shark Tank thing, right? They give you 60 seconds to pitch your business, and if somebody likes you, then you get to go on for the next round of questions. If not, then too bad, kind of thing. That was a fun experience.
I don't know if you can talk about it, but did any investment come out of it? If you're able to.
Yes.
Okay.
We did get investment out of it. The numbers are still yet to be determined. But yeah.
But the TV show was very exciting. Probably Peichen is very modest, but it was probably the largest investment opportunity mentioned in elevator pitch history. So
wow.
He's modest. So I'll pat him on the back on that one. He nailed it. So
how do you get on that show?
We got invited on the show through networking, right? So we know people who knew people, kind of thing. But for other shows, there is an application process, to do that. I would say, we're now, 6 years into the company. So the company name has started to become better known. And so folks are reaching out to us now to talk, right? For example, this producer from Netflix just reached out to us recently. And so, we got interviewed for that show. But it's obviously different now that we have some traction. Back in the earlier days, oh boy, it was, us calling everybody we could, and, trying to network in our way in as much as we can. And, it was a bit of a struggle at first.
Yeah, I hear you on that. So a lot of times I hear people say, even if you don't get investment out of one of those shows, that because you have a consumer product, that it could impact sales in a positive way. Did you experience that? Was it noticeable?
It wasn't particularly noticeable, I would say. Because those investment shows talk more about the business end of the company as opposed to the product end of the company. And so we didn't really, when we spoke to the audience, it was more of speaking with investors as opposed to speaking with potential customers.
Okay. Well, before we move on to questions, I'll just give you guys the opportunity. Was there something you really wanted to share that I didn't ask?
I don't know. Let's see.
Nope.
Yeah, let's let the audience figure out where you want to go. Yeah, because there's so many ways we can go, right? You know, so yeah.
All right. Well, maybe when we're wrapping up with the last question or so,
Okay.
feel free to share something if we haven't asked. So, you in the audience, this is now your turn to ask your questions. You can raise your Zoom hand, and we'll call on you, and you can speak your question. Or if you prefer, if you're a little shy, you can type it in the chat, and I can ask it for you. So usually we seed this a little bit, so we have some questions. So I'll reach out to like Cameron and Jeff, who I know often have questions. Any of you have a question that you'd like to ask Bob or Peichen or both? Oh,
Kenneth just raised his hand.
Okay, Kenneth, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, I'm Kenneth from Sac State, one of the students here that's usually hanging out here over in the Carlsen Center with Cameron and Arlene. And with regards to that initial scaling up, how'd you go about that? Did you just go with a lot of word of mouth, or did you have some sort of way to get the advertising out to the individual companies?
So you're talking about scaling marketing? Is that the crux of it, or scaling manufacturing, or scaling?
Scaling up the business in terms of marketing, yeah.
Okay, in marketing. Okay, yeah. So I'm thinking, how should I answer? I mean, obviously it was really hard, right? Because you're nobody at that point. And so we had to get really, really creative in terms of how we went about marketing. And you know, we've made some substantial, I'm not gonna say mistakes. We had some substantial learning opportunities. So initially we had to learn where we should be spending our time and our money to get the most reach, if you will, right? So, you know, we even tried things like running magazine ads, okay? You know, it was in, I can't remember, Dope Magazine or something like that. And boy, that went over, that was difficult. It was very, very difficult to measure ROI. Okay, let's put it that way. Okay, but it is also it also presented opportunities, right? Because it did get our name out there a little bit. Okay, and so what we had to do a lot was we engaged with folks who wrote about the cannabis industry. Okay, and just told them about our product. You know, anybody who would listen to us, right? You know, it's hard, right? Because people are like, "Who are you? Why should I spend time with you?" So that was some of it. We went to events, right? So the Marijuana Business Conference was certainly one of them. That was a pretty big one where we got to meet folks who were willing to interview us, talk about us, write about us. We went to other trade shows where we did get on, you know, podcasts, and you know, initially some of these podcasts were kind of small, right? The audience wasn't too big, but you know, you're like, woohoo! I got 4 people who saw my article, yay! Right? And so you know, you got to set your goals realistically, if you will. You know, you're not going to go out and get that 100,000 eyeball audience right out of you. We don't even have that today, right? But you just try all kinds of little things, and whatever business you're in, some avenues will work better than others. And unfortunately, you're going to have to spend a little bit of time and energy and money to figure out what avenues will work for you.
Great. So next,
by the way, good question, Joel.
Great. All right. So Joe, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Appreciate it. Good presentation, guys, or rather good interview, I should say. Want to ask a little bit about your end user. So maybe you mentioned it and I had to step away, so perhaps it was when I stepped away. Who is the end product user? Is this more for a B2B type of audience? And to the extent it is there any sort of regulatory requirement? I know it's state level, but are there any sorts of regulatory expectations or requirements around testing of potency? Is it more of a best practice, kind of like places will tell you the calories in a Big Mac, versus an expectation of labeling, which we see in food and drug? Or do any of those things apply? And is that your market, or is this more for you know, smaller scale B2C market?
Yes, 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 yes. The product that we're shipping today is targeted for consumers. Okay. You know, as Bob pointed out, we built this thing to help a friend of ours. Okay. However, and so that's how we targeted all of our marketing initially. Now, what we learned along the way was that it turns out that quite a few people are using this as a business tool. Okay, and that was an unexpected learning, if you will. Okay, and so one of the things you just definitely need to do is keep close to your customer. And so there's a couple of business models that came out of it, right? One of them is simply people who are making edibles for sale, right? So these are I think our very, very first customer was a commercial edibles producer. Okay. And so he needed a tool to help him do quality control on his manufacturing floor, right? Because our product tests infused oils and we give you a number in about 90 seconds. Whereas if he were to test his infused oil, he had to send it out to a lab and wait. Back then it was 2 weeks. And so what that meant was his production flow got halted for 2 weeks while he waited for that answer. And so that this was a quick and dirty for him to keep his production, his factory floor running. Now, what we're seeing today is that there's quite a few people who are using TChecks in sort of that capacity, right? Maybe not, they're not in the $1 million, $2 million commercial space, but what they do is they make edibles and they sell to their friends and family, to treat their neighbors, kids, whatever, that kind of thing. And so there's a fairly substantial cottage industry building up surrounding cannabis. And of course, there's also the other business model where in the entirety of the United States, there are 250 labs. Okay, that's it, the whole of the United States. And so some of these labs, and that's today, right? Some of these labs are not exactly accessible. You're not legally allowed to take your cannabis, stick it in an envelope and mail it, right? That's verboten. Okay, and so there's some limitations there. Now, in those limitations, there's opportunities, right? So there are guys who literally buy these TCheck devices, right, and run their little micro lab for their own little town, right? And so these guys are buying our consumables like crazy. We love them, right? And so there are some business opportunities that arose that we originally didn't anticipate. Now, where we're going is that recognizing that there are these opportunities come up. Oh, sorry. One more thing, big thing, okay, which is hemp farmers. Hemp's a thing, right? Got legalized, and so,
Yeah, under the Farm Bill, correct?
Yeah, 2018 Farm Bill, and so what happened was you have all these people out there growing hemp, and they had to send it to a lab, okay, to get tested so that they don't bust the federal limit. Well, remember, there are only 250 labs in the entirety of the United States, okay? Which means that during harvest season, about now, everybody and their brother is sending material to the lab to get tested. And guess what? Labs get backed up. Well, what do you do with your crop? Do you harvest it now in anticipation of the result, or preemptively harvest, or do you let it ride? Right. Bob just sent me a infographic a little while before this meeting. Right? What was it 40% of which state was it? Tennessee, something like that?
Indiana.
40% of Indiana's crop failed. Okay, failed testing, which means as a farmer, you got to take 40% of your crop and plow it under. You cannot sell it. That the value of that crop went from $35,000 an acre to zero. Okay, and so there's a giant need for it. And so hemp farmers started coming to us saying, can you build something for us right away? I will pay you 40x for your product if you can build something for me. And so that presented a new opportunity. And that's what we're raising money for, right? So we're building the next generation of the device that will enable hemp farmers, first of all, to stay compliant, right, from the cannabinoid measurement perspective. And of course, this machine that we're building is also going to be able to test all kinds of other fun stuff, right? Not just cannabinoids, but potentially terpenes and heavy metals and microbials like E. coli, salmonella, and many other things, right? And so suddenly our world went from just testing edibles to testing almost every dimension of cannabis to potentially testing agricultural products outside the cannabis space, right? Because E. coli and salmonella, they impact everything, right? Chipotle took a $6 billion market cap hit when they had their lettuce fiasco. So I think there are some pretty tremendous opportunities for us, right? Like Bob said, we're an instrumentation company. We're not a cannabis company, and we're going to act like that.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thanks for the detailed answer. I appreciate it. If you have any trouble with banking, let me know. I know some compliance people in the world of banking.
Yeah, for sure, right? Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, guys.
All right. The next question goes to Ben.
Thank you, Peichen and Bob and Sac Startup for putting this on. As a new entrepreneur, these things have been really invaluable for me. So again, really appreciate it. I think, Peichen, you actually started discussing what my question is. So it's kind of a two-part question. It sounds like you guys recently launched. And my question really is around product market fit. So it sounds like you guys are kind of iterating. You launched into this cannabis check, but you're now kind of looking to spread and test other things. So my question is, how quickly are you guys going through MVP to landing on a product market fit? And then how did you guys determine to move from seed funding to start looking for Series A funding?
Okay. Okay. So product market fit. As I said before, in one of my previous startup companies, I blew it up because I held on to the product too long, right? Because I was afraid of somebody stealing it. And so, that was a painful and expensive learning experience. And so this time around, way early on in the product development life cycle, we engaged customers. Okay, ugly, barely functional prototype. And we stuck it in front of people to ask for their feedback, okay? And so you have to very, very, very aggressively figure out what your MVP is. Well, not only that, you have to very aggressively figure out who your target customer is, okay? Number one, that's more important than the product, okay? Knowing who your customer is. And then number two, figuring out what problem you're trying to solve for them. And then, what your product is, God, that's so far down the line, it's almost inconsequential. Okay, and so there's a guy as part of this group, right? Dan Cassasmilli. He I don't know if he still runs that lean startup class.
He's doing it through the Carlsen Center now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't strongly recommend that thing. I can't recommend that thing strongly. Okay. Because that will save your ass. It will save you money. It will save you time. It will save you just so much headache. Okay, because one of the first things you learn in that program is get commitment from your customer. Figure out what it is exactly that you need, and whittle it down to the most bare minimum MVP. Bare minimum. Right? There's somebody out there that once said, if you're not ashamed of the first product you ship, you waited way too long. Okay, and so I guess I can say I'm a little bit ashamed of the first generation TCheck, right? But I can't recommend that thing strongly enough. Just take that, go through that process, learn who the heck your customer is, because boy, you don't want to screw that up, right? Because especially early on in the company's life, some of these decisions can really kill you, right? You make the wrong decision, you're toast, you're dead, right? And you have to limit the existential problems, right? Get those out of the way first. So iterate on a piece of paper first, right? Before you do anything, before you build a single thing.
Yep. And by the way, I just want to reinforce what he just said is we're working on the MVP for our next generation product as well. And we are talking to exactly who we need to talk to, so we know exactly what the MVP is. But that's the only way you can really get your first product out. And then, as Peichen said, we can iterate over that over time. So we're still doing it even on our new product.
For sure.
So a question for you, how long have you guys been selling the, initial product?
Well, so the first generation product we launched, 4-ish years ago. It was in the marketplace for 8 months, 9 months, something like that, before we finally said, okay, we need to move on to the next generation one. So, all told, 4-ish years, give or take.
Okay, great. All right, so there's been a lot of comments. The next question goes to, is it Monet? Is that how you say your name? Would you like to ask your question by unmuting yourself, or would you like me to ask your question? Let's see. All right, I'll start it off. Oh, there she is.
Oh yeah, my connection is like going in and out. So I wasn't sure if you were able to hear me because I am on the road.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay, so I was just wondering at what point did he reach out to angel investors in his business, and like how did he go about it? Like what steps did he take to reach out to them?
With a hardware company, it takes a fair bit of capital to get started, right? Our first products, if you figure out, what the cost of goods sold was, it was, we had a inverted gross margin number pretty severely. So, with hardware, there's a lot of requirements, if you will. So, for example, you're not allowed to go out. Well, you are, but it's difficult to go off and buy, 5 or 10 CPUs, right? You got to go off and buy, hundreds of CPUs all at once. Otherwise, the vendors won't even talk to you, right? They're like, why am I spending my time with you when I'm going to make a $20 sale? Okay, and so there definitely needed to be a fair bit of upfront capital requirement for that. So most of us that started the company, several of us were engineers, so we were able to at least get that part of the design and R&D and all that kind of thing kind of done, and so that helped a lot, right? Because that just minimized our costs. Now when it comes to angels, right? The first round was obviously friends and family. Okay, talking to our parents, talking to our whatever, and brothers, uncles, sisters, whatever, to effectively sell them on the idea. Okay, now one of the very first things I want to point out is that you have to be all in on the company. Okay, you can't. If you want to put somebody else's money into the company, you can't be partly in. Okay, and when you take that first dollar of investment, it becomes very emotional, because suddenly, from your perspective, you're like, I have a responsibility to take care of somebody else's money, and this is money that they worked very hard for. They worked years and years and years to save up this money, and they're entrusting me with it. Okay, and so you definitely got to keep that in mind. Okay, and of course, your own money. When you put in your own money. So in our case, we cashed out our 401k, mortgage, house, all that fun stuff. You damn well better get your spouse's buy-in on this thing. Okay, because you're going to be committing a hell of a lot of time and a hell of a lot of money to this thing. Okay, so that's sort of the early questions that you got to ask yourself. Do you have the guts to go off and do this? And then after that, after you raise that friends and family round, then you start figuring out how to raise the next round, right? So, after our friends and family round, we did get investment from the Sacramento Angels. Okay, now that there was a good period of time between those two, right? And during that time, we learned how to pitch, right? And that was, something that takes a hell of a lot of practice, a lot of refinement, right? You hear about all these people that pitch to dozens or even hundreds of people, and that's so true, right? You got to do that because the first couple of pitches you do can be just god awful. And so that was sort of the next step. And then after that, once you get comfortable, pitching to the next round, it gets a little easier from there.
All right. So,
Thank you so much.
You bet.
So Thor has the next question. He's taken us in a little bit different direction. He's got some technical questions about the product itself. Thor, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because you're saying this is used on the floor where people are needing to do a test right then and there and get results. But what is the connectivity of the device to long-term trends that people might want to look at? Does it have a way to connect via Bluetooth or USB cable to a computer to download a CVS file or to integrate with Excel and do all that jazz? Oh, okay.
Yeah. So another funny story. Okay. When we first launched the initial TCheck product, again, I was on the street corners, right, asking people questions. And in one of the questions that we asked was, how concerned are you about privacy, right? How important is privacy to you? And and the feedback we got was, yeah, it's really important. Okay. Holy crap, big mistake. Okay, big mistake I made there. Because I asked people in the greater Sacramento area, because I asked some people down in San Francisco, but it was clearly not enough because after we took the device down to LA and started selling them down there, one of the earlier questions we got from customers was, how come you just didn't Bluetooth this to your phone, right? And I'm like, well, because if I connect to your phone, I know everything about you, right? You have no idea what we can, once we put an app on your phone, you have no idea how much information I can get from you, right? And the girl just looks me straight in the eye and goes, I post this stuff to Facebook. Do you think I care about privacy? And that was one of those moments where like, oh, damn, I asked the wrong crowd, right? Because here in Sacramento, we're a pretty conservative bunch, right? In LA, not so much, right? So obviously on the second iteration of our product, we went to a Bluetooth model, right? Because the computational power that you have in your phone is unfreaking believable, right? The stuff that we can do is unbelievable. And on top of that, your phone can be cloud connected all the time. And so we suddenly have the power of the cloud, right? Every single mathematical computation you can imagine is now available to us. So now obviously a second generation product is Bluetooth connected to our phone, which is then tethered to the cloud, right? So that helps in terms of one big thing it helps is customer support. Yep. Right? Because the customers, we can now see what the customers are doing. And you know what? Customers love it, right? They're like, yeah, that means I don't have to tell you what I'm doing. You can just look at the logs and boom, there it is. And so that's a huge advantage. Now, flip side of it, okay, is there's a lot of security issues or privacy issues going on, right? There's the DPRS or something like that. And then there's the GPDR and many of those other things, right? And so, as you build the product, as you craft your terms and conditions, as you craft your privacy statements, all that kind of thing, you have to be very, very well aware of all of those implications, right? We do have investors on our, some of our investors who are quite concerned about it, right? Because they've had investments go sideways because of privacy issues, and so that is for sure. Now, moving forward with the TCheck Pro or the next generation product, there's that's only going to increase, if you will, because we're going to allow customers to GPS tag their samples, metadata to meta tag their samples, all that stuff. And so, those are things that we definitely need to work out.
As a real quick follow-up to that, I don't know how proprietary the information is, but what is the tolerance on your device? How accurate can it get?
Actually, that's a really good question. Okay. Because HPLC, right, the $50,000 machine. Okay, well, that's going to be accurate to within 0.1%. Okay. Okay. But you're paying 50 grand for that privilege. So that was one of the questions that we actually had to figure out during our original MVP interviewing process. Okay. Because for us to build a direct competitor to that monster is not going to happen, right? And so of course you can't just ask your customers, how accurate do you think this is? They're like, of course it needs to be the same as accurate as that $50,000 thing, right? That that's their default answer, but that's not really their answer. Okay, and so it took some effort to tease apart what accuracy is good enough. Okay. So, over the years, we figured out that, things like, if our infused oils are within, a couple of milligrams per milliliter of tolerance, that's good enough, right? So it makes sense, right? If you're cooking, pinch of salt, right? You don't know how many milligrams of salt that is, right? Sugar, half a cup-ish kind of thing. And so, so for that was definitely good enough. For things like flour measurements, plus or minus 3 percentage points. And we also learned that for most growers, that's actually good enough. And so that was something that took a lot of effort to actually come to that answer.
Great. All right. So I don't see any more questions. Anyone else have a question you've been wanting to ask but just haven't raised your hand or put it in the chat yet? While you're thinking about that, I just wanted to comment on Peichen, when you said you didn't ask the right people, how important those customer interviews are, and to get a wide cross section of people. I was talking to someone the other day, and he told me investors think such and so about his product. And so he was going to have to move in a completely different direction. And I'm like, well, how many investors have you talked to? 3. I'm like, that's not enough. You need to talk to a lot more people than that. And you're going to get, people are going to give you different answers too. And then that's going to, make you dig deeper into your questions. So the larger the pool, the better. How many customer interviews at a minimum would you say when you're starting out you should do?
I don't know if I can say that there's a minimum. It depends on who your market is, right? In our case, we were originally chasing after the consumer cannabis market, right? Well, there's 44 million of them here in the United States alone, right? Across the world, the number far exceeds 100 million. So, so you're going to get very, very widely varying opinions of what needs, all that kind of thing. Now, if your target market space is smaller, okay, say for example, you're making a product for, how about this? Our next generation product, we're targeted initially towards a hemp farm, right? Okay, well, there's only the hemp farmers in the United States only numbers in the tens of thousands, okay? And so that's a much smaller market space, okay? And they also tend to be a lot more homogenous because they all have to abide by the same set of rules. Okay. And so, I don't, for us to get a good bead on what a hemp farmer needs, we're not going to have to go through 300-400 interviews, right? I think we can get away with a much smaller sample set. Now, one of the things that you have to keep in mind, right, especially if you only do a small number of interviews, is you cannot let one customer or one investor or one whatever drive you off a cliff. And oh boy, can that happen so easily. It's so easy for especially engineers to say, hey, I got this customer that says, hey, I want this XYZ feature. And if I build this XYZ feature, they'll buy it, right? It's so easy to say that. and delude yourself to that. But that customer may very well have just driven you right off a cliff because it's a feature that they need and only they need. Nobody else wants it. Okay, now you are so sweet. Okay, because you spend all this time, money, and energy to build that one thing that only one customer in the world needs. That you're toast.
That is great advice. Cameron has a question about how. Do you want to ask it, Cam?
Sure. Yeah, in line with kind of Laura's question and what you're just sharing, not having one customer drive that, especially if they're not like an early adopter, they'll be wanting all the key features. But I think one of the things that comes to mind as customer interviews, especially when you're standing on the street corner, I'm kind of curious of how you captured that data and the stories they were sharing, and then how maybe you and your team analyzed that information to make decisions of, what features to add or how to go to market, kind of what that process is.
How we capture that information was literally a notebook, a handwritten notebook. When I'm interviewing people or talking to people, I don't like having a physical barrier between me and them, a visual barrier. And so, what I see as a laptop is that physical barrier. And so I try to avoid laptops or anything like that as much as possible. Now, tablets, I think are better, right? Because they flatten, so there's nothing, literally in your line of sight. So it was that. Now, what happened was we went out and, we obviously had started with a whole set of assumptions, right? Pricing and what you can do and all kinds of things. And so, and by the way, if you're doing a physical product, it really, really helps to have a physical manifestation of it, even if the thing doesn't even work, right? I mean, you're standing, I was literally on a street corner. So you don't plug it in, it's nothing. You can't be whipping out weed to test it on a street corner either. Just something for them to touch and feel and look, and it makes it feel a little bit more real for them, okay? And so they give you a little bit better feedback, okay? That helps. Now, if your product is virtual, software, whatever it is, then have a mock-up on your phone, right? There's zillions of tools out there. I mean, hell, you can use PowerPoint to mock up an app nowadays, right? And PowerPoint has the ability to do taps and touches and drive you to different places. And we've done that too, right? Where you mock up a phone app and you take this app and you literally stick in front of somebody and say, here's my phone, go drive this app. Okay, tell me what you think about it. What would you do? What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? So that's how we went about getting feedback. Now, feedback for things like price, that's much harder. Okay. You're gonna have to get a little creative in terms of how you go about asking that question, okay, with regards to price, right? And admittedly, over the years, we've had to do a lot of work in terms of figuring out what price the market will bear. Okay, and we've done a lot of price elasticity experiments, right? And some of those elasticity experiments hurt, right? Because you crank up the price too high, your sales go down to zero, and you're screwed. Okay, and so and then you crank the price too low, your sales go up, and you don't have the capability to manufacture them. And so there's always that balance that you have to strike.
All right.
Thank you.
So great answer. Last chance to the audience to raise their hand or ask a question while they're thinking about that. I did tell you earlier that if there was something we didn't ask you about that you thought we should know, this is your chance to share it.
I can let Bob speak, but I can also tell you from my perspective.
Well, you can both tell us.
Go for it, Peichen first.
Okay. Building a company hurts like a bastard, let me tell you. I figured it was hard, right? But I never figured it was this hard. Okay. The difficulties that we've encountered are unanticipatable. Okay, you'll never, there's some obvious ones. Okay, sure, but you're going to run into stuff that you can never in your wildest dreams imagine. And you have to be able to get through it, right? The money thing is hard, right? I mean, there were times when Bob and I had to run to the ATM machine and withdraw cash out of our own personal bank accounts just to make payroll. Boy, that hurt. Okay. I went 4 years not taking a single dime in salary. And so, yeah, so be prepared for that. But more than that, if you're married or if you have, attached somehow, your significant or your spouse or something better be all in, okay? Because you ain't gonna do this on your own. You're gonna come home from work and you just got punched in the gut, right? And you're like, I'm not sure I can make it through this, and your spouse is gonna be the one that's gonna dig you out of that black hole. Okay, I told you before, I mortgaged, the house and 401k and all, right? She damn well better be on board with that one because it's her retirement too. Okay, and so I don't think I can stress that kind of thing enough.
Thanks, Peichen. Bob?
Yeah, and Peichen was talking about perseverance, right? And perseverance. And first of all, every startup takes a lot longer to have an exit than you ever anticipated, right? Even with Serologic, we thought it was going to be a 2-year or 3-year thing, and it ended up being a 5-year thing. So it always takes you almost twice as long, but sometimes it's worth it, and it gets easier over time. But the other thing is there's a counterbalance to perseverance, and when you need to know when it's not going. If you start, and we both have had failures, right? Is when do you cut and run, right? And in my heart, you in your gut you'll know, that this is going to work or this isn't going to work, and you just can't. After a while, it's better just to cut and run and try something new, or do a pivot, right? What the VCs will say, do a pivot. But the other thing I just want to reinforce what Peichen said is you need to have a very supportive spouse who understands that you're working 10, 12, 14 hours a day continually. You're working on weekends and everything else. And you really need to have whoever your spouse is or your partner is or whoever it is, they have to be bought into this. Otherwise, it's going to be, if you work all day and work your butt off and then you get screamed at night, is untenable. So you really need to be in sync with your significant other. So. And by the way, and when things go right, it's awesome. Peichen, we've had some great times, Peichen, but we've had some very dark times too. But you have to celebrate your successes, right? And so, when I started this off, I love working for TCheck right now because it's a really dynamic company and it's a new business that I've never been in before.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I've really enjoyed interviewing you and learning more about TCheck. I love products as opposed to software. It's a business model that I understand a little bit better. So it was really fun to talk to you guys about this. So if everyone could give them a round of applause, do your Zoom hands or your icons. Thank you so
all
much
for being patient.
Yeah. Oh, this was wonderful.